Hey guys, welcome back. So this is part two of the media module that looked at the different types of media that advertisers and marketers would be interested in placing their ads in order to communicate with certain audiences. So today we're spending a bit of time looking at print media and specifically within that newspapers versus magazines. So this is the overview slide, which you'll be familiar with from last time. Today we're looking at print media. So newspapers is a major part of print media, and it historically is the leading ad medium, but obviously with all that audience fragmentation that we were talking about last time, the readership for newspapers is going down, and so those companies are then struggling and trying to, I guess, conglomerate with other news providers, or in some cases are being bought out by other media giants, and being added to their portfolio as another way of placing ads in order to get the attention of audiences. So newspapers were very popular because that's what people were interested in, right? They were interested in news and current events. And so if you recall in the last lecture, I asked what the point of any media was, and the main point was to get attention. And news is still the #1 way of getting people's attention. It's just the way in which news is shared now, the platforms and the channels that it is funneled through to the audience is very different now compared to traditional newspapers that you might remember your parents or grandparents using, the big sort of sheets of paper where the ink would come off on your fingers. The delivery of that news content now is very different. In any case, though, when a person is looking at an ad within a newspaper setting, whether it be print or some other sort of digital delivery of that news, they are doing so at a fairly controlled pace. So there's a bunch of news that the person will want to get through, so they're kind of moving along fairly briskly, but they are also paying attention to the content quite intently, and so these ads then are able to be processed in that audience's own time. So if you compare that with the last lecture I had on broadcast media, where we talked about TV ads and radio ads, that was very much broadcast ads that are dictated to the audience in terms of how much time they have to spend on that ad, usually, right? It's usually a 30-second ad or a 15-second ad, and whether it's TV or radio, the ad comes and it goes, and whether the audience has managed to engage with it or not that's not really part of the picture anymore, right? Because it's channeled out there in a unidirectional manner. So with newspapers, even though it's still a unidirectional conveying of the information, the pace at which a person can interact with that ad, pay attention to it, maybe take a break from reading the paper and look at the ad, that pace is very much at the control of the audience. So that's one of the key differences between a broadcast ad communicated through TV or radio versus a print ad, and in this particular case, a newspaper print ad. It's a high involvement media. I mentioned that earlier about how people paying attention to the newspaper content will be paying attention, so they are involved. And the cool thing about newspapers is that it's one of the few media, or it is a medium, where people will often still use it to actively seek ads. So this is quite different when we compare it once again to TV or radio, right? Nobody tunes into the radio or the TV for the ads. But with newspapers, some people tune in for the news, but a lot of the times people will also get a newspaper because they're interested in, the classifieds, which is essentially an entire newspaper full of ads, or there will be, in that mindset anyway of looking at, real estate, for example. There are different types of newspapers. So there's the daily ones, which we're familiar with, such as the Herald or the Dominion Post. Then there's the weekly newspapers, which are, obviously they take a bit longer to produce because maybe they're a little less well funded. And so these are those sort of local papers that we think about, such as the Central Leader or the Western Leader or the Eastern Leader. There are these national newspapers. And I guess a more accurate term, they would almost be international newspapers. So the Wall Street Journal, for instance, is a publication. It's a news publication. It's current events, but it pertains to world current events rather than specific regional or country level current events. There are special audience newspapers, so ethnic newspapers, like the Sing Tao is a common New Zealand example of a Chinese newspaper specifically designed to attract the attention of the Chinese ethnic group. There are supplements within newspapers, so these are kind of a blend between current events but also lifestyle type of readership. So Canvas for entertainment, Canvas for lifestyle, and Time Out for entertainment. So these are supplements that go within the main newspaper that specialize on a particular topic, such as entertainment or healthy living or other lifestyle interests. And finally, there are magazines that can also be considered sort of like a newspaper, or even within a newspaper, sometimes they will have magazine inserts that operate in a similar way to these supplements. So these are all different ways in which news agencies will provide different content to try and reach specific types of audience members, but also to sort of increase the accessibility of their platform. In terms of newspaper advertising, there are certain terminology that you want to know about so you know what you're dealing with. The first one is display advertising. So this is the type of ad that appears in a newspaper, a traditional newspaper we're talking, not the digital version. Although this language has been adopted by digital banner advertising as well. They use words like banners and skyscrapers, pop-ups, that sort of stuff. That came from the newspaper industry, where they talked about half-page, quarter-page, full-page spreads. And so those dimensions you see there are obviously the amount of attention that any given ad can have when displayed on that newspaper medium. The bigger the ad, the more the attention, and so you can probably work out that the more it would cost then for a bigger ad. So that's display advertising. Classifieds, I mentioned before, these are those sections specifically designated for paid advertisements. So automobile classifieds, where people place ads for their used or new vehicles. The real estate section, where people post information about the houses they want to sell. There's other classifieds for used goods, such as your secondhand bike, for instance, or a pram that you no longer use. So this is one of those few examples where the medium actually consists completely of ads, and people are still interested in engaging with it. And finally, pre-printed inserts. So these are those ads that, if you have a traditional newspaper and you give it a shake, they all fall out the bottom. And these are those pamphlets and brochures that people have paid a certain amount of money to be incorporated into that news publication. In terms of paying for newspaper advertising, a common term is the ROP, or run of paper rate. And so this is when you, as the advertiser, pay a certain amount of money based on what they call rate cards. So these are cards that have the rates of the newspaper, and then depending on the size, you pay a certain rate. And then a run of paper rate means that the newspaper decides where the best place for your ad to go is, given the formatting of the way the newspaper looks. And so the ads basically appear at the discretion of that newspaper. In contrast, if you pay a little bit more, you get what's called a preferred position rate. And this means that you negotiate with the newspaper whereabouts you would like that ad to go. So what section of that newspaper. And for this, obviously, you're paying a premium charge. Here's a really good example of a creative newspaper ad. So even though a newspaper isn't traditionally thought of as a creative medium, this one is advertising Game of Thrones. And you can see, obviously, it's designed to look like the dragon is flying overhead as you're reading the newspaper, so it's casting a shadow, right? So this is a double page spread. It would have most likely have been, a preferred positioning of the ad in the middle of the newspaper to really get that sort of double page effect. And then obviously down the bottom, that call to action for people to watch the TV show. And so I guess the irony of this is that this is a TV show who's designed to get attention so that people can advertise in it. but has become so successful that it's kind of advertising itself. The other interesting thing about Game of Thrones is it's not the type of content that you could easily do a product placement, right? So as a show, even though it's highly popular, the challenge for advertisers is how do they advertise using a piece of content like Game of Thrones. They can't put their product within it, and we know that advertising in between works, but is not ideal because people tune out, or in some cases if they stream, they can zip past those ads, or if they download them in some other way, they will just completely bypass the ad. And so this is one of many challenges that advertisers are facing when the content is highly attractive to the audience, as in it gets a lot of attention, but at the same time it's very difficult to pay to place an ad in. So some pros of newspapers. So I mentioned before how the people are paying attention, they're in that right mental frame, it's high involvement. When they're dealing with news, often it is with this foundation of reality, so it's not make-believe, it's real current events, and so they're primed to think more rationally and more logically, which would work for certain products and services better than others. It's got mass audience coverage. So you can still reach a lot of people because most often people are interested in the news, and readers of specific newspapers tend to be more economically and educationally upscale. So you're reaching an attractive audience. It's flexible in terms of those different sizes and therefore costs of the ads that you're deciding to invest in. And it also turns around really quickly. So less than a week you can get an ad in your local newspaper. There's ability to use detailed copy, so because it's a high involvement media, people are paying attention to it, and because they're also in that right mental frame in terms of being rational, they can work through your arguments a lot more with a lot more attention. If you contrast this to something like radio or TV, people often, if they're not watching a documentary, if they're watching something fictional, then their frame of mind will be more sort of imaginative, maybe relaxed, maybe more emotionally aroused, and so they don't want to be confronted with a lot of information about your product at that point. But with newspapers, it's kind of the opposite. It's timeliness, so people, attend to the news because they're interested in current events, and so when you advertise in the news, it gives the impression that your product is still of value today, right? It gives that edge of sort of timeliness and that you're still relevant. The audience controls that pace. We talked about that before compared to TV or radio, where the pace is very much dictated to the audience. And you can get this geographic selectivity. So as I mentioned before, you can, depending on the newspaper that you're advertising in, you can get it down to specific regional areas. What are some cons of newspapers? So the clutter. So if you think about your traditional paper, or even if you think about the digital appearance of a news story now, there's a lot of clutter in terms of advertising on the side, down the bottom, and so just like I asked you to try to remember back to the ads that you watched on TV or heard on radio, I'll invite you now to also think about the last time you read the news, and when you saw any brands, if you can remember the brands that were advertised on that news content or alongside that news content. And if you can't remember specific brands, it's probably because you weren't paying attention to the ads, but also probably because of the clutter that the ads were placed amongst. It's not particularly selective in terms of lifestyle, and that's why those news agencies have started to create these supplements such as your Canvas lifestyle supplement or your Time Out entertainment guide, trying to get a little bit more selective. And so the argument then is that as an advertiser, you don't have to advertise in the Herald because that reaches a different group of people. You advertise specifically in the Canvas to get those that are more interested in cafes and restaurants, etc. It's got a very short lifespan, especially when we compare it to magazines later. So a newspaper typically is only read for a couple of days, maybe a week at most, and then often it gets recycled. The reproduction quality is mediocre because we're still talking about traditional ink printing. Very few colors, the resolution not very good. So therefore there is a lack of prestige often, which is ironic because the audiences that you do reach with newspaper are those educationally and economically upscale ones. So you would argue that they are the ones that are in the market for your luxury brands, but because of the mediocre reproduction quality, you have to be careful advertising in newspapers that whatever your brand ends up looking like, or the ad that is talking about your brand, doesn't come across looking, a little bit rugged and tasteless. The national buying is slightly complicated. As I mentioned before, there's all these different regions that you can target, but that means that if you want a national campaign rolled up by a newspaper, then you have to work with the different news agencies and buy ads specifically with those different agencies. And the changing composition of readers. So as I mentioned in the first slide, the newspaper readership is going down, and if you think about yourselves, how many of you actually read the newspaper? You probably get your news through your social media, and even though the content is sourced from the news agencies, you are not an exact direct reader of their content, and so there is a declining readership there. And that is partly because of this internet threat, which is an ongoing issue for all media. Right, moving on to magazines. So this is within that broad category of print media. There's hundreds of special interest magazines nationally and internationally. So it's ideal for targeting specific lifestyle segments. So there are two main categories when we talk about magazines. Most of the ones that you're familiar with are 2/3 of the magazine industry, and they're the consumer mags. So these are the mags that you see at the supermarket in the magazine stand, right? Women's Weekly, The Listener, Women's Day, TV Guide, Metro, all those sorts of magazines, Cosmo, for example. Then there are the trade mags, which you probably don't see as often, and these are the business-to-business magazines, which are just as valuable in terms of an advertising channel for marketers as your consumer mags, because a lot of business is business-to-business advertising as well. And we classify them by the audience, so the type of people that read that magazine, perhaps where they're located. Those demographics of readership is very important, and so for every single magazine, if you look up their website, they'll tell you the typical reader profile that is interested in that magazine. So the argument once again there is that people of a certain demographic and prefer a certain lifestyle will be attracted to pay attention to specific types of magazines. And as an advertiser, you want to know which ads your audience is paying attention to so that you can advertise in those magazines. The editorial content then dictates what is the content that is within that magazine, and therefore what is of interest to various consumer profiles. Sometimes the physical characteristics play a role. So we're talking, the glossy sort of magazines like Vogue versus the more newspapery ones like the TV Guide, right? And so the physical printing and the size and the type of paper that's used can also be taken into account. The distribution and circulation, so where this magazine is available and how many people have subscribed to it. And so all these things put together lead you to the question of, where would you advertise a new something, right? So a new brand of toilet paper or a new brand of health supplement, So if you think about your particular brands that you're working on in your group assignment, what type of magazines might work given the editorial content? Right? If you're working with supplements, then health magazines are an obvious choice, right? If you're working on Earth Initiative, which is the sustainable toilet paper, then some sort of homemaker magazine or home decor magazine might be more relevant. This is an example of a rate card from Cosmo. So there's some prices on the left there. And basically, it's how you pay to place an ad in that magazine. So you'll notice that obviously the full page ads are worth the most, or they cost the most because they get the most attention. And if you want color, it costs even more because it gets more attention. So if you keep going back to this idea of what is the point of any media, and it is to get attention, then you'll very quickly see that the cost of advertising is directly correlated to the amount of attention that any form of media can grab. So with magazine advertising, there are several techniques we talk about. One is called bleed, and that is simply when the ad is printed all the way to the edge of the page that it's being displayed on, and this gives a greater visual impact. It's borderless. And this was only made available when printing technology could print images right to the edge of the page without it bleeding over and creating a mess on all the other pages. So if you look at some of the old school magazine ads, you'll notice that they all have borders, and that's because the printing only enabled them to print up to a certain closeness to the edge. But now we can go right to the end, and that certainly is the way that most magazines are printed. The gatefold, and so this is when you have a piece of the magazine that flips open to expand the size of the page, and that obviously guarantees attention, because when you're reading a magazine, who can ever resist flipping over an additional flap, right? Creative space buy, so this is where you buy certain ads strategically to tell a story or get more attention for your ad, and a common technique there is to buy 3 pages in a row, for instance, right? And have this a similar ad displayed 3 times in quick succession. And so slightly different ad, slightly different ad, slightly different ad, but it's the same brand each time, maybe telling a story or showing the product in different user settings. This will get attention. It'll also get that repetition and remind the person what the brand is about. Advertorials, so this is getting a little bit sneaky. Sometimes this is known as native content in a digital setting, but magazines kind of did this first. And so this was when, you know, advertisers will pay a magazine a little bit extra to write some content related to the general theme of that magazine. But it's actually an ad about a product, but it reads very much like part of the editorial content. So a great example is, let's say you've got a magazine such as Cosmo. So we know that that reaches young professional females, probably interested in fashion. And so an advertorial would be then the marketer for a new brand of makeup might pay for their magazine to write a page about this new makeup, but do so in a way that it looks like it's part of the editorial content. Now they have to say somewhere that it is a paid advertisement or an endorsement of some sort, but often that is not as obvious as it should be, and so a person will start reading thinking that it is the actual content of the magazine, when in fact it's a paid ad. So there are pros and cons to this, obviously, right? The pros for the magazine is that, you know, they're getting a lot of extra money to do this because they develop and customize the ad in a way that has it blend in with the content of the magazine. The cons for the magazine is that they start to lose credibility if they do too much of this. People buy the magazine similar to people tune in to a TV show for the content, not for the ads. And so if you start selling a lot of your space to your ads and you're sacrificing content, then people will start to take your magazine less seriously. And plus you also kind of risk this idea that you're selling out and the content then becomes questionable. So that people start to think, you know, when they read an actual proper piece of editorial content, is that still an ad for something? Is there some sort of angle here? And so this starts to touch on this ethical line between advertising and its influence on content generation, right? So for example, if you're a magazine and one of your biggest advertisers spends, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars advertising their product with you, and then you do a review as part of your editorial content, would you be more or less likely to say good or bad things about the product of that advertiser, right, of that company? If you say bad things about the product, because that's what your audience actually want to hear about, because they want your, you know, expert opinion, that's good for your editorial content, but it could be very bad for your advertising revenue. So these are one of those interesting things that are happening all over advertising that we have to always consider. Promotional materials, so magazines are a good way of integrating with sales promotion, which was covered earlier in the course. So if you've got free samples of new conditioners or body lotions, you know, in those little sachets, you get those stuck onto the magazine. And once again, I mean, it only works for the first person that uses it, but it still gets a lot of attention, and you've got a sample happening there so people can try the product. And so that's a good way of, you know, getting the right audience to try your product. And then this last advertising technique in magazine called a printacular, which I'm a huge fan of. So these are those really elaborate magazine ads, and I've got some examples coming in the next slide. So here are some examples of print-taculars. The one above is for a jewelry company. They make necklaces, watches, and rings. And so you can see there they've integrated a print-tacular series of ads in that particular magazine, where one is a cutout of a necklace, another is a watch that you put your hand through, and the last one is a ring that you put your finger in. You can see how a print-tacular like that would definitely get attention, but would also cost a little bit because you're disrupting the way that that magazine is printed, right? All of a sudden they don't just roll it off the printing press anymore. There's stuff they have to do to that magazine in each one of those issues. So you're gonna have to pay more for it. But on the flip side, you definitely get attention, and even better, you get engagement and interaction with your brand. The one below that is the Wonder Bra cleavage example. So this is a really funny ad because it's using the double page spread, and there's once again a print-tacular component where it's a bit of string that the reader has to tighten up, and it gives the magazine some cleavage. This is another example of a print-tacular for in a kids magazine for a chewing gum. So it's basically an origami sort of design there, where you open up the middle spread and it shows the inflated bubble gum bubble. So what are some pros of magazines? It can reach large audiences. So even though they're quite selective, some of those selective audiences are quite large if we think about them from an international point of view. So like Time Magazine, who will reach a selectively, business and politically orientated audience, but worldwide it's quite a large audience base. Similarly, National Geographic will reach selectively, those people that are interested in nature, geography, science, current events as well, I suppose. Still, internationally, that's a very large audience. So there is that capability, even though it's a selective media. So in fact, it is the most highly selective media that we have. Second is probably something like radio, which is also quite selective if you think about it. So with radio, you can pinpoint the type of people you want, but magazines, you can really pinpoint the type of people they are, because it's often lifestyle-based editorial content. So it is the easiest way to reach segmented groups. It's got a long lifespan, so 75% of people keep their magazines, and if you think about what they do with those magazines, they often have them on display, either at their home or in terms of businesses at their place of business, right? So the classic example there is the waiting room at a doctor's practice or a dentist's practice. So there's a bunch of magazines in there. The advertisers, if you think about it, pay once to advertise their brand in that magazine for this first subscriber of that ad, who's probably someone that worked at this office. But then when that person brings their magazines to the office, because they're done with them, those magazines sit there, and every person coming in is going to have a look at those magazines. And so you're getting added exposure to that ad, whereas the marketer, you only really paid once for it. So that's a definite pro. When people read magazines, they're doing so at a leisurely pace. So we mentioned about how TV and radio, it's very much, the pace is dictated by the media. So the TV, ad's got 30 seconds, then it's done. Similar with radio, it just goes, then it's done. The audience will rarely, find the ad in order to go back to really listen or watch it again. And with newspapers, even though the audience controls the pace, it's quite brisk because there's a bunch of information the person wants to get through before they start their day or during their coffee break. But with magazines, if you think about it, people are sitting there, it's the weekend, or maybe it's after work, it's at home, they're relaxing with a cup of coffee, maybe they're in the waiting room, so they're not in a rush there either. And so they're really processing this magazine at a very leisurely pace, which means the frame of mind is at a sort of relaxed mood. The reproduction quality of ads in magazines is quite high. The type of printing techniques and the paper that it's printed on is very good, and so therefore it can be a very prestigious medium. And the cool thing about magazines is sometimes the magazine values its reputation so much that it won't even advertise any old brand simply because it can pay the magazine money. So if you think about something like Vogue and the type of brands you see advertised in that magazine, those brands essentially make up 75% of that magazine, and it actually adds to the reading experience of that magazine. So in a sort of perverse irony, it's the ads that actually make the magazine attractive, and they're not going to just sell that ad space to any old brand, right? Because they're trying to keep their reputation, and because they do that, their actual content becomes more prestigious, and the ads that they can then display become more prestigious, and it's the sort of upbuilding of their reputation. Detailed information is possible within magazines because of this leisurely pace. The audience controls the pace. They're also paying attention to the information because it's obviously an area that they're interested and passionate about. And so an ad can have a lot of information about a particular product that's positioned within that magazine, because it is likely that the audience reading that magazine will have a foundation of knowledge about that particular topic or lifestyle or interest already. So the type of ad that you place in a magazine will be slightly different to one that you're placing in TV or radio, where it's more designed for that mass reach. For magazine, it's a selective, very segmented medium, and so the information can be a little bit more detailed. You can convey information with authority in a magazine. So often these magazines exist because the people that put them together, the editorial group, are experts in that area, right? So Vogue, to go back to that example, they're all fashionistas, right? They're all highly connected with the fashion world, and so anything you see in that magazine comes through with the sense of authority. And because of that, there's sort of a halo effect that occurs with any ads that you see in that magazine. And so when you see an ad about a particular brand in Vogue, you automatically assume that it's a highly fashionable brand because the reputation of that magazine has been developed around this authority in terms of fashion. Right. Similarly, if you see an ad for a camera in National Geographic, automatically you assume that that camera, just because it's been advertised in National Geographic, must be a really good camera, because that magazine, National Geographic, has been built around top quality photography. We talked about this high involvement potential, so people, because they can control the pace and it's a written medium, people can pay more attention to it, and often they are paying attention because they're interested in that content, and so the way they approach your ads will be more high involvement as well, which means you can get more information across, information which would be a lot more difficult to convey through something like radio or TV. And finally, we saw that through some previous examples how magazine, even though it's a still medium, still enables quite a lot of creativity to exist within that medium. What are some magazine cons? So cost can be a con. Some magazines are quite expensive. It's not intrusive, so unlike TV and radio that really grabs your attention because of the sight and sound, with magazines, even though you could try to make the ads eye-catching, it's still very much part of that process of a person flipping through the page, and it kind of just rolls over, right? We had some examples of using gatefolds and print-taculars and strategic positioning of ads within magazines that'll try and get that intrusion value to really grab the attention of the person, but it's not the same as like a really impactful TV or radio ad. There are long lead times for magazines, so several months in advance sometimes, particularly if you want to get your ad into a special themed issue. So Cosmopolitan is a good example where they have, like a wedding issue at a certain time of year. And so in order to get your ad into that issue, you need to give them a lot of lead time. And you probably also need the lead time to get your photographers and production team in advance to create this high quality ad that's going to go in a magazine. So unlike a newspaper that can pivot, within a week, you just get the copy, get the text to the newspaper, and they can get the ad out within that same week. With a magazine, it takes a lot longer. So weeks to month, as I mentioned. There's clutter in magazines, just like there is clutter in most media, to be honest. But magazines in particular, if you think about, I mentioned the example of Vogue, where even though the ads very much form part of the consumption experience of the magazine, there is just brand after brand after brand. And if you think about the last time you flipped through a magazine, what was a brand that you remember being advertised in that magazine? You probably can't remember exactly, can you? Some magazines are 70% ads, so that adds to the clutter. Low reach and frequencies. So magazines are periodical, so they come out once every couple of weeks or months, and so that means that the frequency will be quite low. And because it is a highly selective media, apart from a couple of magazines that have like a worldwide subscription base, most magazines are very sort of localized and reach very specific types of people, and so the reach will be lower, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because the thing with reach is you want to reach the right people, not just a lot of people that aren't interested in your brand. When you work on your group assignment, I invite you to think about, the product you're using, the brand that you're trying to communicate, and think about the types of magazines that would be best used to communicate the value of the brands that you're working on. It is hard to measure this readership and circulation. So I mentioned before, so this is a bit of a pro and a con, right? Basically, there are, two main sources of revenue for magazines. One is the readership. So these are the people that subscribe to the magazine, and that's part of the circulation number, which is just another word for ratings in the magazine speak. So these people are the ones that pay for the content because they're interested. They pay attention to that content of that magazine. Now, you would think that these are very important people because they're people that are willing to support the magazine, so much so that they're paying for the magazine to subscribe. They're actually the least important people for a magazine. The most important are actually the advertisers, right? Now, when I was editor for the University of Auckland Business Review, we went through this thought of whether we try to get advertising for the University of Auckland Business Review, or we try and go advertising free, which was what we did in the end, because the university was, generous enough to support that publication for a number of years. In discussing this idea of advertising, you come to a very quick realization that it doesn't even matter if nobody subscribes to your magazine, as long as you can prove a certain number of people pay attention to your magazine. That's when you can start making money. So a great example of this is the Red Bulletin. So this is a magazine that Red Bull create for free. At least it used to be free. I don't know if it's still free, but they used to give this thing out for free. But it became so popular that they could then start to sell advertising for it, right? So think about that. They create this content to promote their brand. They do it so well that they can start to charge other people money to promote their brands in this magazine that they created to promote their brand in the first place, right? And now if it is no longer free, that's an even better endorsement of how successful that model was. So they're the people that pay for the magazines, and the real value of them isn't so much the subscription fees, although that helps, but a magazine won't even break even if you just rely on subscription fees. What subscription fees does guarantee, though, is a certain number of people that are interested in that magazine. In other words, a certain number of people that are willing to pay attention to that magazine. And it's those subscription numbers that form the circulation rates, which then the magazine can sell that attention to advertisers. So they can basically say to advertisers, we have a subscription rate of 20,000 people, that's our circulation rate, and because 20,000 people have proven their loyalty to our magazine because they're paying us subscription fees, that means when you advertise with us, you can reach at least 20,000 people. But in terms of measuring the rest of the readership, that is a con for magazine, because how do you measure the pass-along readership? How do you measure the public availability of a magazine that's left in a waiting room? Right, and so what you're only ever getting in terms of reach numbers or circulation rates for magazines are those first-time subscribers. I mean, those subscribers that purchase the magazine. You're not getting the extra people that they pass along to. So primary circulation rates are the only ones that are ever used. Even though the actual circulation rate might be higher, unfortunately for magazines, it's almost impossible to figure out how many people read the magazine, and therefore how many people are eligible to see the ads that are placed within any given magazine. Right, so next time we're going to look at out-of-home support media, which includes billboards, transit advertising, and this really cool thing called ambient media. See you next time.